The woman's sobs cut through the mountain silence like a knife through flesh. And when Matthias Crane stepped onto his porch that frozen December morning, he found her crumpled against his woodpile, her burgundy dress dark with blood that wasn't entirely her own. He'd been living alone in these Colorado mountains for 3 years, ever since the war had carved out whatever part of him used to care about people. His cabin sat at the edge of Timber Ridge, where the pine forests grew so thick that sunlight barely kissed the ground, and where decent folk knew better than to venture without cause. The mining town of Silver Bell lay 5 miles downslope, close enough to sell his furs and far enough to avoid questions about the scars that roped across his back like a roadmap of suffering. The woman looked up at him, with eyes the color of winter moss green with flecks of gold that caught the weak morning light. Her face was angular and striking, marked by exhaustion and something harder to name. Terror, perhaps, or determination worn thin. She couldn't have been more than 30, though the lines around her mouth suggested she'd lived longer than her years. "Please," she whispered, her voice scraped raw. "They're coming." Matthias should have turned away. Every instinct honed by survival screamed at him to bolt the door and pretend he'd never seen her. But something in those eyes, a wildness that matched his own, kept his boots planted on the frost-covered planks. "Who's coming?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. "Everyone," she said. And then she collapsed. He caught her before her head struck the wood, cursing under his breath as her weight settled against him. She was tall, nearly matching his own 6-foot frame, with a lean strength that spoke of hard work rather than parlor softness. Her dark auburn hair had come loose from its pins, cascading over his arms in waves that smelled of wood smoke and fear. Matthias dragged her inside, kicking the door shut with his heel. His cabin was sparse, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rope bed in the corner, and a table he'd built from pine logs. Furs hung from the rafters, and the air held the permanent scent of leather and tobacco. It wasn't a place for visitors, especially not blood-soaked women who spoke in riddles. He laid her on his bed and assessed the damage with the clinical efficiency he'd learned as a field medic during the war. The blood on her dress came from a deep gash across her left shoulder, already clotting but angry and red. Her hands were torn, the kind of wounds you got from climbing rocks or tearing through brush at speed. More concerning were the bruises circling her wrists like purple bracelets, rope burns. Recent and brutal. As he cleaned the wound with whiskey that made her gasp back to consciousness, he studied her face more carefully. This wasn't some lost traveler or wayward wife. Everything about her, from the quality of her dress beneath the damage, to the small Derringer pistol he found strapped to her thigh, to the way her eyes snapped to the windows even in her weakened state, spoke of someone running from something specific. "What's your name?" he asked, threading a needle with steady hands. She watched him work, those moss-green eyes calculating. "Evangeline Mercer." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, with the weight of someone confessing or perhaps lying, made him pause. "You want to tell me why you're bleeding on my mountain, Miss Mercer?" "Mrs.," she corrected, then caught herself. "Or I was. I'm not sure what I am anymore." He stitched the wound in silence, feeling her flinch with each pull of thread through skin. She didn't cry out, didn't beg him to be gentle. Just gritted her teeth and stared at the ceiling beams, her jaw working like she was chewing through her own pain. "They'll check the trappers' cabins," she said finally. "That's what Marshal Kane said. He said you can't hide in these mountains, that they know every cabin, every cave, every place a person might run." Marshal Kane. Matthias tied off the final stitch, his movements going rigid. From Silver Bell? From everywhere. She sat up too quickly, wincing. "He's not really a marshal. None of them are what they claim to be." The fire popped in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the first snow of a storm began to fall, the flakes fat and heavy with the promise of days of white. Matthias moved to the window, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. "Start from the beginning," he said, "and make it quick. If Cain's involved, we don't have much time." Evangeline stood, swaying slightly, and joined him at the window. Up close, he could see the faint scar that traced her jawline, the calluses on her palms, the way she held herself like a loaded weapon. 6 weeks ago, my husband was murdered in Silver Bell, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Thomas Mercer. He owned the assay office, and everyone thought it was a robbery gone wrong. But I found his ledgers, the real ones, hidden in the walls of our house. He'd been documenting everything, the silver claims that never existed, the miners who paid for licenses but never got them, the families who lost their land to fraudulent debts. And Marshal Crane? He runs it all. She turned to face him, and in the firelight he could see the tears she'd been holding back. He killed Thomas. And when I tried to take the ledgers to the territorial governor, Cain's men came for me. I've been running for 3 days. They killed my horse yesterday, and I've been on foot ever since. Matthias felt the familiar weight of other people's trouble settling on his shoulders. This was why he'd come to the mountains, to escape exactly this kind of entanglement. But as he looked at Evangeline Mercer, with her torn dress and determined eyes, he realized escape was an illusion. The world always found you, no matter how deep you buried yourself. "The ledgers," he said. "Where are they?" She reached into her bodice and pulled out a leather-bound book, no bigger than a prayer book, its pages swollen with moisture and use. "Right here. Every name, every crime, every dollar. It's all Thomas documented for 2 years. A sound cut through the morning, distant but unmistakable. Dogs. Evangeline's face went pale. "They've picked up my trail." Matthias made a decision that would change everything. He grabbed his rifle from above the mantel, shrugged into his heavy coat, and tossed her a thick wool blanket. "Can you ride?" "If I have to, you'll have to." He moved to the back of the cabin, where a section of the floor lifted to reveal a narrow cellar. "There's a horse in the lean-to out back, a mountain mustang, mean as hell but sure-footed. Take her and follow the creek north until you reach the old mining camp at Widow's Peak. Wait for me there." "What are you going to do?" He smiled, and it wasn't kind. "I'm going to buy you some time." "And Miss Mercer?" He caught her arm as she moved toward the hidden door. "Those ledgers better be worth dying for, because that's what we're looking at now." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared desperation. "They're worth it," she said. "And it's Evangeline. If we're going to die together, you might as well use my name." Then she was gone, disappearing through the cellar as the baying of hounds grew louder. Matthias checked his weapons, said a prayer to a God he no longer believed in, and stepped out into the snow to face whatever was coming. The woman had been crying outside his cabin, and now he was going to make damn sure she'd have the chance to cry again safely, somewhere far from here. The dogs arrived first, 3 massive bloodhounds crashing through the underbrush like fury incarnated in fur and fang. Matthias stood on his porch with his rifle across his chest, watching as they circled the cabin, their noses working the ground where Evangeline had collapsed hours earlier. Behind them came the men 6 riders emerging from the pine forest like specters, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The lead rider wore a Marshal's badge that caught the weak sunlight, but there was nothing lawful about the way he sat his horse. Marshal Crane was a compact man with the kind of face that looked pleasant until you saw his eyes flat and cold as river stones. He smiled when he saw Matthias, showing too many teeth. "Morning, Crane," Crane called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "Didn't expect to find you up so early. Most hermits sleep till noon." Most marshals don't run hunting parties at dawn, Matthias replied, keeping his rifle casual but ready. What can I do for the law today? Crane dismounted, his men fanning out in a practiced formation that spoke of military training or worse. They were all armed with repeating rifles, new Winchesters that cost more than most men made in a year. Whatever operation Crane ran in Silver Bell, it was profitable. We're tracking a fugitive, Crane said, moving closer. His hand rested on his own pistol, the gesture almost casual. Dangerous woman. Killed her husband and stole from his office. You seen anyone matching that description? Haven't seen anyone in 3 weeks, Matthias lied smoothly. Except the deer I shot yesterday, and she didn't have much to say. One of Crane's men, a scarred brute with a face like beaten leather, laughed at that. Crane didn't. He studied Matthias with those dead eyes, then gestured to the dogs, which had begun pawing at the porch steps. Funny thing about bloodhounds, Crane said. They don't lie. And right now, they're saying our fugitive was here, recently. The air between them crystallized with tension. Matthias calculated distances, angles, the position of each man. 6 against 1 were bad odds, but he'd survived worse during the war. The key was making them believe he was cooperating right up until the moment he wasn't. All right, Matthias said, lowering his rifle slightly. I did see someone. Last night, maybe 3 hours after dark. Woman stumbled past, heading north toward the high country. Didn't stop, didn't talk. I figured she was lost, and you didn't think to report it? Crane's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. Report to who? You're the first person I've seen since November. Matthias shrugged. Besides, a man learns to mind his own business up here. Curiosity gets you killed. Crane considered this, then nodded to his men. Search the cabin. Matthias didn't move to stop him, though every instinct screamed against letting strangers into his space. The scarred brute and another man pushed past him, their boots heavy on his floor. He heard them overturning his sparse furniture, pulling furs from the rafters, poking through his supplies with the thoroughness of professionals. Meanwhile, Crane circled the cabin's exterior, studying the tracks in the fresh snow. Matthias had been careful. He'd walked the perimeter himself after Evangeline left, obscuring her trail to the lean-to. But Crane wasn't stupid, and he was looking for patterns that didn't fit. You live alone up here, Crane said. Not quite a question. That's the general idea. Must get lonely. Man could go crazy with nothing but trees and silence. Some of us prefer the company of trees, Matthias said. Trees don't steal. They don't lie. And they damn sure don't pretend to be law while hunting innocent women. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Crane stopped walking and turned to face him fully, and now the pretense dropped away entirely. His hand moved to his pistol grip, not drawing but ready. Careful, Crane, Crane said softly. You're a long way from anywhere, and nobody knows you're up here. Man could disappear in these mountains, and who'd ever know? You threatening me, Marshal? Just stating facts. Crane's smile returned, sharp as a blade. But since we're being honest, let me share some more facts. That woman you claim wandered past? She's carrying something that belongs to important people. People who don't take kindly to theft. Anyone helping her hide would be considered an accessory to murder. You understand what I'm saying? I understand you're wasting time, Matthias said. She went north. You want her, you better get moving before the storm hits. As if summoned by his words, the snow began falling harder, the flakes swirling in the wind that came howling down from the peaks. Crane glanced at the sky, and for the first time, Matthias saw frustration crack through his calm facade. The two men emerged from the cabin, shaking their heads. Nothing, boss. Just furs and trapper gear. Crane cursed under his breath, then whistled for his dogs. They came reluctantly, still sniffing around the porch, but followed when he mounted his horse. "We'll be checking the other cabins," Crane said. "And Crane? When we catch her, and we will catch her, I'm going to ask who helped her. If your name comes up, I'll be back. And next time, we won't be so friendly." "I'll try not to lose sleep," Matthias said. Crane spurred his horse, and the group disappeared into the forest, heading north just as Matthias had suggested. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then counted to 100 before moving. The lean-to stood behind the cabin, empty except for scattered hay and the lingering scent of horse. Evangeline had taken the Mustang as instructed. Good. She had maybe an hour's head start, possibly two if Crane wasted time checking the other cabins first. But the dogs worried him. Once they realized he'd sent them in the wrong direction, they'd come back. And no amount of misdirection would hide Evangeline's trail. Then Matthias went back inside and gathered supplies with military efficiency: dried meat, hardtack, matches wrapped in oilcloth, ammunition, his winter coat, and bedroll. He took the emergency cash he kept hidden in the chimney, $40 in gold coins, and strapped on his second pistol. Whatever life he'd built here was over the moment he'd chosen to help that woman. He should have resented her for it. Instead, he found himself thinking about the way she'd held that ledger. The determination in her eyes, the tears she'd shed for a dead husband who'd apparently died trying to do the right thing. Before leaving, Matthias did one final thing. He took a bottle of kerosene and splashed it across his rope bed, his table, the furs he'd spent 3 years collecting. Then he struck a match and dropped it. The flames caught quickly, eager and bright. By the time Crane figured out he'd been played, the cabin would be ash, and any evidence that Evangeline had been there would be smoke on the wind. Matthias stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his home burn. 3 years of solitude, of trying to outrun his past, of pretending he could exist apart from the world. All of it reduced to flames because a woman had cried outside his door. "You better be worth it." "Evangeline Mercer," he muttered, then turned and ran. The creek that led to Widow's Peak was frozen in places, treacherous with ice and hidden rocks. Matthias followed it north, his breath coming in white clouds, his legs pumping through snow that grew deeper with each mile. The storm was building one of those mountain blizzards that could bury a man alive if he wasn't careful. He found Evangeline's trail within half a mile, the Mustang's hoofprints clear in the fresh snow. She was pushing hard, which was good. They needed distance. But she was also leaving a trail that a blind man could follow, which was very bad. 2 miles up, the creek forked. Evangeline had gone left toward the old mining camp. But Matthias heard something that made his blood run cold. The distant baying of hounds. Back on the right trail and closing fast. Crane had figured it out. Matthias broke into a run. Ignoring the burning in his lungs, the protest of muscles pushed too hard. The trees thinned as the altitude increased, the wind growing teeth that bit through his coat. Ahead, through the curtain of falling snow, he glimpsed the skeletal remains of Widow's Peak, a handful of collapsed structures that miners had abandoned when the silver ran out. And there, standing beside the Mustang, was Evangeline. She'd found a rifle somewhere, probably from the horse's saddle, and she held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. When she saw him, relief flooded her face, quickly replaced by alarm as she heard the dogs. "How long?" She shouted over the wind. 10 minutes, maybe less." He reached her side, gasping. "They know I lied. Crane's got his blood up now. Then we fight." 6 armed men against 2? Matthias shook his head. "We need to disappear. There's an old mine shaft up ahead, the Lucky Catherine. Entrance is hidden behind a rockfall. If we can reach it before they spot us, they'll track us to the entrance and wait us out," Evangeline interrupted. "We'll be trapped. You got a better idea?" She looked at him, and something fierce blazed in those green eyes. "We make them think we went over the ridge. Lead them on a false trail, then double back through the ravine. There's an old prospector's path, barely more than a goat track, that cuts through to the western slope. If we can reach it before they close the net." "That's insane," Matthias said. "The western slope is a 3-day ride from anything resembling civilization." "Exactly." She mounted the Mustang, then reached down to pull him up behind her. "And Kane won't expect it. He'll think we're running for the territorial line or the nearest town. He won't believe we'd go deeper into wilderness." The dogs sounded closer now, their baying hungry and eager. Matthias made a split-second decision, the kind that defined whether men lived or died. He swung up behind Evangeline, his arms circling her waist, feeling the tense coil of her body. "Go," he said. She kicked the Mustang hard, and they shot forward into the storm, racing against time and hunters and the gathering dark. Behind them, Matthias heard shouts, Kane's voice raised in triumph, and knew they'd been spotted. The chase was on. And only one ending was certain: blood in the snow before nightfall. Part 3. The Devil's Bargain. The Mustang screamed as it climbed, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on ice-slicked rock. Evangeline guided the horse with brutal precision, one hand on the reins, the other gripping the rifle laid across her lap. Matthias clung to her, feeling every labored breath of the animal beneath them, every treacherous slip that could send them tumbling into the ravine that yawned to their right. Behind them, gunfire cracked through the storm-warning shots, or maybe just frustrated rage. The bullets went wild, swallowed by wind and snow, but it meant Kane's men were close enough to shoot. Too close. "There!" Evangeline shouted, pointing toward a slash in the mountainside, a narrow path that looked more like a scar than a trail. "The prospector's track." She wrenched the Mustang's head around, and they plunged into the gap. The walls closed in immediately, rock faces pressing so tight that Matthias's shoulders scraped stone. The horse balked, whinnying in fear, but Evangeline drove it forward with voice and heel until it surged ahead. Into darkness, the path twisted like a snake's spine, climbing and descending in sickening lurches. In places, the floor disappeared entirely, forcing them to dismount and lead the terrified horse across spans of rock barely wide enough for its hooves. The storm had followed them into the ravine, funneling wind that howled like dying men and snow that blinded. "How do you know about this path?" Matthias shouted over the noise. "Thomas and I prospected these mountains when we first came west," Evangeline called back. "Before Silver Bell, before everything went to hell. We were young and stupid and thought we'd strike it rich." Her voice caught. "We found copper, not silver. Barely enough to justify filing a claim. But we mapped every trail, every shaft, every hidey hole for 50 miles. "And you memorized it all?" Thomas drew maps. "I remembered them." She glanced back at him, her face a pale oval in the storm. "He always said I had a mind like a steel trap. Turns out that's useful for more than remembering recipes." The path opened suddenly onto a ledge that jutted from the mountain like an accusing finger. Below them, the ravine dropped 200 feet to a creek bed choked with boulders. Above, the rock face rose sheer and smooth, offering no handholds, no escape. They were exposed here, visible from multiple angles. Matthias heard it the same moment Evangeline did, the scrabble of hooves on rock, the low voices of men who'd found the path's entrance. "They're coming through," she whispered. "They had minutes at best." Matthias scanned the ledge, looking for options, and spotted something that made his heart race: a wooden beam protruding from the cliff face, half buried in snow. The entrance to a shaft, probably abandoned when the vein played out. "In there," he said, pointing. "It could collapse. Better than a bullet." He was already moving. pulling the reluctant Mustang toward the shaft. The opening was narrow, the beam above it cracked and groaning under the weight of decades of snow. But inside, the darkness promised concealment. They pushed into the shaft just as the first of Cain's men emerged onto the ledge. Matthias pressed against the wall, barely breathing. As the rider, the scarred brute from earlier surveyed the empty ledge with suspicious eyes. "Tracks end here," the man called back into the ravine. Cain appeared moments later, his face dark with fury. "They can't just disappear." "Maybe they went over the edge," another man suggested. Peering into the abyss below, Cain dismounted and walked the ledge's perimeter, his eyes taking in every detail. He stopped at the shaft entrance, and Matthias's hand moved to his pistol. Inside the tunnel, the Mustang shifted nervously, and Evangeline laid a calming hand on its neck, her other hand covering its nostrils to keep it quiet. "Old mine," Cain said, studying the rotted beam. "Probably caved in years ago. Want us to check it?" Cain was silent for a long moment, and Matthias could almost hear the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Then the Marshal shook his head. "We're losing light, and this storm's only getting worse. They've got maybe an hour before they freeze to death if they're out in this. We'll make camp at Widow's Peak and wait them out. They'll have to come down eventually. What if they already made it over the ridge? Then they're dead by morning and the problem solves itself." Cain mounted his horse. "Either way, come dawn, we'll find bodies." The men withdrew, their voices fading back into the ravine. Matthias counted to 500 before allowing himself to exhale. Beside him, Evangeline sagged against the wall, her whole body trembling, whether from cold or terror or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. "We can't stay here," she said. "When the storm clears, they'll check every hole in this mountain. I know." Matthias moved deeper into the shaft, feeling his way along the wall. His hand touched old timber supports, then open-air a branching tunnel. "Help me find something to burn. We need light." They worked by touch, gathering scraps of rotted wood, old burlap sacks, anything that might catch fire. Matthias sacrificed one of his oilcloth-wrapped match bundles, and soon a small fire guttered to life, throwing wild shadows on the shaft walls. The tunnel stretched back into darkness, supported by timber frames that looked increasingly dubious. But 30 feet in, they found what Matthias had hoped for, an intersection where this shaft met others, part of a network that honeycombed the mountain's interior. "How far do these go?" he asked Evangeline. She studied the tunnels, her face drawn with concentration. "If this is the Lucky Catherine, and I think it is, then these should connect to the Silver Bell mine about 2 miles west. That one had a bottom entrance that opened onto the opposite side of the mountain." "Should?" "It's been 7 years since I was last here. The tunnels might have collapsed. They might be flooded. Or they might be our way out." She met his eyes. "It's a gamble. Everything's a gamble now." Matthias fed more wood to the fire. "We rest here for an hour, let the Mustang recover. Then we try the tunnels. Even if they collapse halfway, it puts more distance between us and Cain." They sat in silence, the fire between them, while the Mustang munched on grain from the saddlebags. This close, Matthias could see the full extent of Evangeline's injuries, not just the stitched shoulder, but bruises along her ribs, a split lip that had scabbed over, the rope burns on her wrists. Someone had hurt her badly, and recently. "You said your husband documented everything," he said carefully. "For 2 years. That's a long time to collect evidence. Why didn't he go to the authorities sooner?" Evangeline's jaw tightened. "He tried. Twice. The first time, the territorial Marshal Cain's superior told Thomas he needed more proof. The second time, Thomas sent a telegram to Denver to a federal judge he'd served with during the war. 3 days later, a man claiming to be a federal inspector arrived in Silver Bell. Thomas met with him, showed him some of the evidence. She paused, her voice dropping. They found the inspector's body in a played-out mine shaft a week later. Accident, the local doctor said. He'd fallen down a vertical shaft in the dark. But your husband didn't believe it. The inspector was a careful man. Thomas knew him. He wouldn't have gone down a mine shaft alone, in the dark, without proper equipment. Evangeline pulled the ledger from her dress and held it up to the firelight. After that, Thomas got paranoid. He started keeping the real records hidden, making copies, storing them in different places. He told me that if anything happened to him, I should take this to the nearest army fort where Kane's people couldn't reach. What happened? Her voice went flat, emotionless. 2 weeks ago, Thomas told me he'd found something new evidence of where Kane and his partners were hiding the money they'd stolen. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in a false front bank in Denver. He said it was the final piece, the proof that would bring them all down. That night, he went to check on something at the assay office. When he didn't come home by midnight, I went looking. She stopped, her hands trembling around the ledger. I found him on the floor, his throat cut. Kane was there, going through the files. When he saw me, he smiled. He actually smiled and said, "Your husband was a stubborn man, Mrs. Mercer. I hope you're smarter." But you ran. I grabbed the nearest weapon, a fireplace poker, and swung it at his head. Caught him across the temple, and while he was stunned, I ran. Got home, grabbed the ledger from its hiding place, and fled. She looked at Matthias, and in her eyes he saw not just grief, but a cold, burning rage. I've been running ever since. 3 days of hell, and every minute I think about Thomas lying on that floor. About how he tried to do the right thing, and it got him killed. Matthias understood that rage. He'd carried his own version since the war, since he'd watched his entire unit get slaughtered because of a commanding officer's incompetence. The desire for justice or vengeance, which was often the same thing, could keep you alive when nothing else would. "This evidence your husband found," he said. "The bank records. They're not in the ledger?" "No. Thomas hid them separately, in case the ledger was ever discovered. He told me where they were the morning before he died, but I haven't had a chance to retrieve them." "Where?" Evangeline smiled grimly. "Inside his coffin. I had him buried with a false bottom built into the casket. The documents are sealed in an oilskin pouch hidden under his body." Matthias stared at her, then laughed a short, sharp bark of sound that echoed off the tunnel walls. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the craziest. Can I be both?" She stood, brushing rock dust from her torn dress. "The hour's up. We should move before Kane decides to check the tunnels after all." They doused the fire and moved into the darkness, Matthias leading the Mustang while Evangeline navigated by memory and intuition. The tunnels branched and twisted, some barely wide enough for the horse, others opening into cathedral-like chambers, where their footsteps echoed like whispers from the dead. Twice they had to backtrack when passages ended in cave-ins. Once they crossed a chasm on timber boards that flexed alarmingly under their weight. The Mustang balked at that crossing, and only Evangeline's soothing voice and firm hand convinced it to try. Time lost meaning in the absolute dark. They might have been underground for an hour or 10 hours, there was no way to tell. Matthias's legs ached, his lungs burned from breathing stale air, and he started seeing lights at the edges of his vision that he knew weren't real. Then, impossibly, they turned a corner and saw actual light wan and gray, but undeniably real. The bottom entrance to the Silver Bell mine stood ahead, half blocked by a rockfall but passable. Beyond it, the storm had broken, and dawn was painting the western slopes in shades of rose and gold. They emerged like creatures from a nightmare, covered in rock dust and dirt, blinking in the sudden brightness. Below them, a valley spread out, green with pine and unmarked by human presence. No towns, no roads, no signs of Cain's hunters. "We made it," Evangeline said, wonder in her voice. "We survived," Matthias corrected. "Making it means getting those documents and bringing Cain down. We're not even close to finished." She turned to him, and in the morning light, he saw her truly for the first time, not a fleeing victim, but a woman forged by loss into something harder and more dangerous. "You're right," she said. "So here's my question, Matthias Crane. Are you in this to the end, or do we part ways here?" He should have said goodbye. Should have wished her luck and disappeared into these mountains to build another cabin, another solitary life. But he thought about his burning home, about the 3 years he'd wasted hiding from the world, about the way this woman had cried outside his door and changed everything. "I'm in," he said. "To the end, whatever that looks like. Even if it means going back to Silver Bell? Even if it means digging up a dead man's grave? Especially then." Evangeline extended her hand and he shook it. Her grip was strong, her palm calloused and warm. "Then we're partners. And partners share everything, the danger, the risk, and hopefully the victory when this is over." "Victory," Matthias repeated. "I like the sound of that." They mounted the Mustang and began the descent into the valley, leaving the mines and the mountains and their pursuers behind. Neither spoke the obvious truth, that going back to Silver Bell meant walking into the lion's den, that Cain would be waiting, that the odds of survival were vanishingly small, but sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. And if you were going to burn, it was better to burn fighting than running. The devil's bargain was made, and there was no going back. 3 days later, they stood in the darkness of Silver Bell Cemetery, watching the night clouds race across a moon that seemed to be holding its breath. The town lay quiet below them, its false front buildings lined up along the main street like crooked teeth. Matthias could see lamplight in Cain's office, could hear the tinny piano music drifting from the Lucky Dollar saloon, could smell the wood smoke and horse manure and human desperation that marked every mining town. "Tell me again why we're not." "Just riding for the nearest army fort," Matthias whispered. "Because without the bank documents, the ledger is just a list of accusations," Evangeline replied. She held a shovel in one hand, the Derringer pistol in the other. "Cain's lawyers will shred it apart, but with the documents showing where the money went, who received it, how it was laundered, that's ironclad proof. Ironclad proof doesn't matter if we're dead. Then let's not die." They'd spent the 3 days circling back to Silver Bell, moving at night, avoiding roads and people. The Mustang had given out on the second day, and they'd released it on good grazing land before continuing on foot. Matthias had used the time to teach Evangeline what he knew about survival and tactics from his war years. She'd proven an apt student with an instinct for strategy that surprised him. The cemetery sat on a hill above town, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had seen better days. Most of the graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, but some of the more prominent citizens had proper headstones. Thomas Mercer's grave lay in the northeast corner, its earth still fresh, its granite marker catching the moonlight. Evangeline moved toward it like a woman in a dream, her steps slow and deliberate. Matthias followed, scanning the darkness for movement. Cain would have men watching the cemetery, it was too obvious a target. But they'd seen no one on their approach, which worried him more than a visible guard would have. "Here," Evangeline said, kneeling beside the grave. Her fingers traced the carved letters of her husband's name. For a moment, her mask slipped and Matthias saw raw grief wash over her face. "I never got to say goodbye. They wouldn't let me see him after Cain's investigation. Said the body was too disturbed, that I shouldn't remember him that way." "We'll make this right," Matthias said. "I promise you that." She nodded, standing and raising the shovel. "Then let's do this." They dug in silence, the sound of metal biting earth unnaturally loud in the stillness. The soil came up easily, still loose from the burial. Matthias worked with methodical efficiency, while Evangeline spelled him when his arms grew tired. The hole deepened, and with each shovelful, Matthias felt the weight of what they were doing, the desecration, the risk, the sheer audacity of robbing a grave to catch a killer. The shovel struck wood after 20 minutes of digging. Matthias cleared the dirt from the coffin's lid, revealing simple pine boards stained dark. He looked at Evangeline, saw her jaws set with determination, and pried the lid open. Thomas Mercer had been a handsome man in life, with the same angular features as his wife. Death and a week underground had not been kind to him, but he lay peaceful, dressed in his Sunday suit, his hands crossed over his chest. Evangeline made a small sound, half sob, half prayer, and reached into the coffin with shaking hands. She found the false bottom exactly where she'd said it would be, hidden beneath a layer of satin lining. The oilskin pouch lay underneath, sealed with wax and string. She pulled it free, cradling it against her chest like a child. "Got it," she whispered. "Then let's." The click of a hammer being cocked cut through the night like a death knell. "I was wondering how long you'd make me wait," Kane's voice came from behind them. 3 days I've had men watching this cemetery. 3 days of betting when you'd show up, and what do you know, tonight's the night." Matthias turned slowly, hands visible, to find Kane standing 10 feet away with a pistol aimed at Evangeline's head. Behind him stood 4 men, all armed, all wearing expressions of predatory anticipation. They'd walked into a trap as obvious as sunlight. "Let her go," Matthias said. "Your quarrel's not with me, no?" Kane smiled. "You burned your cabin to cover her escape. You've been helping a fugitive. That makes you my quarrel too." He gestured with the pistol. "Both of you, out of that hole, slowly, and Mrs. Mercer? I'll take that pouch." Evangeline climbed from the grave, her movements deliberate, the oilskin pouch still clutched in her hand. "These documents will destroy you," she said. "Everyone in that bank ledger, everyone you've paid off, everyone who helped you steal from this town, it's all here. You think I don't know that?" Kane laughed. "Your husband was thorough, I'll give him that. But you see, I've spent the last week making preparations. By morning, that bank will be empty, the money moved to accounts in Mexico. Those documents become meaningless once the trail goes cold. The ledger is circumstantial. You said it yourself, without the bank records, it's just accusations. And now I'll have both." He stepped closer. "I almost admire you, Evangeline. You've led me on quite a chase. But it's over. Give me the pouch, and I'll make your deaths quick. Refuse, and I'll take my time." Matthias watched the men fanning out, calculating odds and angles. 5 against 2, but Evangeline had her derringer, and he had his 2 pistols. "If they were quick, if they were lucky, I'll give you the pouch," Evangeline said suddenly. "On one condition." Kane raised an eyebrow. "You're not in a position to bargain. Matthias goes free. He walks away. No pursuit, no retribution. This is between you and me." "Evangeline, no," Matthias started. "It's my husband, my fight," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was steady, resigned. "You've done more than enough. Go home, Matthias. Build another cabin. Live the life you wanted before I ruined it." Kane considered, then nodded. "Done. Crane walks, you give me the pouch, and this ends clean." "No." Matthias grabbed for Evangeline's arm, but she twisted away, pressing the oilskin pouch into his hands along with something else, cold metal that he recognized as the Derringer pistol. "Trust me," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. Then louder, "The pouch is yours, Kane. Come and get it." She pulled the ledger from her bodice and held it up, then threw it not at Kane, but at his feet. In the split second that every eye followed the flying book, Evangeline grabbed Matthias's pistol from his holster and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The first bullet took Crane in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second hit one of his men in the chest. The third went wild as Crane's return fire caught Evangeline in the side, dropping her to her knees. Matthias moved on instinct, years of military training taking over. He put 2 rounds into the nearest gunman, dove behind a headstone as bullets chipped granite around him, and emptied the derringer into the third man's throat. That left one, the scarred brute from the mountain, who had his rifle aimed at Evangeline's head. "Drop it, Crane!" The man shouted. "Drop it or she dies." Time crystallized. Matthias saw it all at once. Evangeline bleeding in the dirt, Crane crawling toward his dropped pistol, the brute's finger tightening on the trigger. He saw Thomas Mercer's open grave, the scattered ledger pages catching the wind, the town of Silverbell sleeping in ignorance below. He thought about the cabin he'd burned, the life he'd abandoned, the woman who'd cried outside his door and changed everything. And he made his choice. Matthias dropped his pistol, then threw himself forward in a diving roll, scooping up the derringer's spent shells and hurling them at the brute's face. It was a desperate move, buying seconds at best, but seconds were enough. The man flinched, Matthias closed the distance, and they went down in a tangle of fists and desperation. The fight was brutal and short. The brute was stronger, but Matthias was faster and had nothing to lose. He got his hands on the rifle, wrenched it sideways, and fired. The sound was deafening, the result immediate. Silence fell over the cemetery like snow. Matthias staggered to Evangeline, who sat with one hand pressed to her side, blood seeping between her fingers. Crane lay 5 feet away, his shoulder wound bleeding freely but not fatal. The other men weren't moving. "The documents," Evangeline gasped. "Did you? I've got them." Matthias showed her the oilskin pouch, miraculously intact. "And the ledger's scattered but recoverable." "We did it." "No, you did it." She smiled through pain. "I was ready to give up to trade my life for yours. But you wouldn't let me." "Partnerships work both ways," he said, tearing strips from his shirt to bind her wound. "You taught me that." Behind them, Crane coughed. "You think this changes anything?" "I have friends' resources." "You'll never make it to the army fort alive." Matthias looked at the Marshal, this small man who'd built an empire of corruption and murder, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He picked up Crane's pistol, checked the chambers, and aimed it at the Marshal's head. "Matthias, don't," Evangeline said softly. "If you kill him like this, you become what he is. We have the evidence. Let the law handle it. The law is broken. Then we fix it. But not like this." She reached up, her hand shaking, and lowered his gun. "We've come too far to lose ourselves now." He wanted to pull the trigger. God, how he wanted it. But he saw the plea in her eyes, the conviction that doing the right thing mattered even when the cost was high, and he understood why her husband had loved her. "Fine," he said. "But if he comes after us again, all bets are off." They bound Crane with rope from his own saddle, loaded him and the ledger onto one of the horses, and began the long walk to the nearest army fort 3 days east, through territory that would test every reserve of strength they had left. Evangeline's wound was serious but manageable if they moved carefully. Matthias supported her, one arm around her waist, as they descended from the cemetery. The sun was rising as they reached the edge of town, painting Silverbell in shades of copper and gold. People were emerging from their homes, drawn by the sound of gunfire, gathering in small clusters of confusion and fear. "Wait," Evangeline said, stopping. "I want them to see." So they walked down the main street in full view of the townspeople, the bloodied woman and the grim-faced man. leading a bound Marshal and carrying documents that would expose the corruption that had poisoned their home. Word spread like wildfire, and by the time they reached the far edge of town, a crowd had gathered. An old man stepped forward, the general store owner, recognizable by his apron. "Mrs. Mercer? Is that you?" "It's me, Mr. Patterson," she said. "And I have proof of what happened to Thomas and to all the others Crane and his men have hurt. What do you need?" She looked at the gathered crowd, at the faces marked by hardship and hope, and straightened her spine despite the pain. "I need witnesses. People who'll stand up and say they saw Marshal Crane brought to justice. People who'll testify to what they've seen and suspected. I need you to be brave enough to finish what my husband started." Patterson looked at the bound Marshal, at the blood on Evangeline's dress, at the documents Matthias carried. Then he nodded. "You'll have your witnesses, ma'am. Every honest person in this town will speak, I guarantee it." Others stepped forward then, adding their voices to his. The shopkeeper, the blacksmith, the widow who ran the boarding house. One by one, they pledged to stand as witnesses to tell the truth no matter the cost. Crane, through his pain, sneered. "You're all fools. This changes nothing." "It changes everything," Evangeline said. "You built your empire on fear and silence. But that ends now." They rode out of Silver Bell 2 hours later with an escort of 20 armed townspeople, who'd volunteered to see them safely to the army fort. Crane rode in chains, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit broken. The documents and ledger were secured in saddlebags, protected by men who decided that corruption would not stand unchallenged. The journey to the fort took 4 days instead of 3, slowed by Evangeline's injury and frequent rest stops. But they made it, and when they arrived at the gate with their bound prisoner and their evidence, the commanding officer took one look at Crane's pale face and ordered him locked in the stockade immediately. The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed. The documents were exactly as damning as Thomas Mercer had hoped, detailing not just the theft and fraud in Silver Bell, but similar operations in 3 other towns. Within 2 weeks, federal marshals had arrested 17 men, including a territorial judge and 2 prominent bankers. The trial was held in Denver, with Evangeline and Matthias as the primary witnesses. Crane and his co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 20 years to life in federal prison. The money that could be recovered was returned to the victims, though no amount could restore what had been stolen, not just wealth, but lives, futures, and faith in justice. Through it all, Matthias stayed by Evangeline's side. They were interviewed by newspapers, lauded as heroes, offered rewards and commendations. But what mattered most to Matthias was the way Evangeline's eyes gradually lost their haunted look, replaced by something that might have been peace. 6 months after the trial, they stood once again in the Silver Bell Cemetery. The town had been renamed Silver Hope, a symbolic fresh start, and Thomas Mercer's grave had been properly restored, with a new marker that read, Thomas Mercer, 1840 to 1874. He died for truth. He lives in memory. Evangeline laid flowers on the grave, her hand lingering on the cool granite. "I did it, Thomas," she whispered. "I finished what you started." Matthias stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy with her grief and her triumph. When she finally turned to him, her eyes were wet but smiling. "What now?" she asked. He'd been thinking about that question for months. The reward money from the territorial governor sat in a bank account, enough to build a new cabin or start a new life. But he found he didn't want to go back to the mountains, didn't want to return to that solitary existence that had been less about peace and more about hiding. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that Silver Hope could use a new assay office. Someone honest to run it, someone who knows the business." "And you know someone like that?" She stepped closer. I was hoping to learn from the best." Evangeline laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her since that morning outside his cabin. "Are you proposing a business partnership, Matthias Crane?" "I'm proposing whatever you want it to be," he said honestly. "Partners in business, partners in rebuilding this town, partners in figuring out what comes next. I spent 3 years alone on a mountain, and I learned that survival isn't the same as living. You taught me that." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then I accept. Partners in all things rebuilding, living, and maybe something more when we're both ready." "When you're ready," he corrected. "I'll wait as long as it takes." They walked back to town together as the sun set behind them, painting the world in shades of amber and rose. Below them, Silver Hope bustled with activity, new businesses opening, families building homes, a community finding its footing after years of corruption. It wasn't the ending Matthias had imagined that morning when he'd found a crying woman outside his cabin. But it was better than any ending he could have dreamed. Because Evangeline had been right from the beginning. Sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. And sometimes, when you came out the other side, you found that you weren't alone anymore. Years later, when people asked them about those harrowing days, about the chase through the mountains, the midnight grave robbery, the shootout in the cemetery, Matthias and Evangeline would exchange glances and smile. They'd built something good in Silver Hope, an honest assay office, a community center, a life that mattered. But more than that, they'd found each other. Not in romance, though that came eventually, slowly and carefully as grief gave way to healing. But in partnership, in trust, in the shared understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else help carry your burdens. The ledger that had started it all sat in a glass case in the territorial courthouse, a reminder that truth, no matter how dangerous, was worth fighting for. And every year on the anniversary of Thomas Mercer's death, Evangeline would visit his grave and tell him about the town he'd saved, the people he'd protected, and the future he'd made possible. She never stopped missing him. But she'd learned that grief and joy could exist together, that honoring the dead meant living fully in the present. And on those anniversary visits, she never went alone. Matthias would stand beside her, his hand in hers, a silent promise that she would never have to cry alone again.